Welcome Bob Budiansky and Simon Furman. So I'll let them go ahead and do their thing, and just wanted to check with everyone. Did everyone get a raffle ticket?
No. Yes. Nope.
Did everyone get a raffle ticket when you came in the door?
No.
If you didn't get one, go back outside, and the gentleman that's at the front of the door will provide you with one. Okay. Yeah.
So towards the end of the panel, we're going to give away figure. So we're running around
Whenever you want to jump in.
Okay. All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. Gentlemen, the floor is yours.
Okay. Hello, everybody. Thank you for coming. My name is Bob Budiansky, Simon Furman. We're going to be doing a Q&A with everybody, but first, I'm going to do a little bit of a background on me. Sorry, not much about Simon in this part. But anyway, just to give you an idea of what my involvement is on Transformers over the years, and then that might help you generate some other questions later on. So let's get rolling. All right, so Transformers, you all know that part, okay. So I first got involved with Transformers very early on in November of 1983, almost 40 years ago. And I'm only 41 years old. So anyway, what you see here is the original treatment, or the backstory to Transformers. This was written by Marvel Editor-in-Chief Jim Shooter. And he did it as part of his day job. And so all the mythology that has evolved over the years on the Transformers started with this treatment. And it's only a few pages. I'm not going to leave it here for you to read the whole thing, but it's page 2. And sorry. Get used to it. And page 3. And you'll see things in there that you recognize. And page 4. And now you see some things are getting scribbled out and changed. That's actually my handwriting. So by this time, Jim Shooter had brought me into the mix of helping to develop this property that Hasbro brought to Marvel. And so there was a mountain that the Ark crashed into up in Washington State or something like that. Originally it was Mount St. Helens, which is a real mountain, which is a real volcano that had recently exploded. So they wanted to fictionalize it. It became Mount Hillary. And for whatever reason, Jim Shooter named the spaceship that landed in the mountain millions of years ago Auntie. And maybe somebody with a different perspective, so I thought that Auntie sounded pretty silly. I won't tell you my personal opinion, but anyway, it got changed to the Ark, and so on. So he would just tell me change this, change that, and I just scribbled it in because we didn't have word processing programs back then. So, and then continuing. And so here's page 5, a couple more cross out, and page 6. And now we're at some of the characters. So I think you're probably all familiar with Buster Witwicky. Originally his name was Spike. The Witwicky family was a family that Jim Shooter grew up with in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, from what I understand. So he adapted that name for this part of the backstory. And again, for reasons I don't understand, Spike was changed to Buster. And now we have some of the characters. So this is kind of where I get it. So I didn't write this part with the characters, Optimus Prime, Prowl, but some of the other names were rejected, like Alctar. You see that name up there in the upper left? Alctar was a rejected name. I renamed it Starscream. Okay. So what happened was Jim Shooter brought in another editor at Marvel, a senior editor who had a lot of writing experience, asked him to develop all the characters and their names. And except for those first two, Optimus Prime and Prowl, he rejected all the other names, Alctar being one of them. And then, at some point, I got involved. So here's my involvement. Okay, so he brought me in. It was the weekend before Thanksgiving week, of November '83, and he needed to turn something into Hasbro toys for their approval, I guess before Thanksgiving. So I was an editor. I was an editor at the time at Marvel. I didn't have a lot of writing credits. I had a lot more art credits. So Jim Shooter, after rejecting the senior editor's written work on all the character development, he went down what we called editorial row, which was just a bunch of offices with each office being an editor and an assistant editor team. He went from one to the next, starting with the editors that had some writing experience. I believe probably the first person he spoke to was Larry Hama, who had already developed G.I. Joe for Hasbro through Marvel Comics. And anyway, one by one, all the editors who had writing experience rejected the idea of spending their weekend before Thanksgiving coming up with 26 character profiles and new names for all these toys that meant nothing to them at the time. So eventually it came to me. I was about maybe the fourth or fifth choice after all these other people turned them down. And I said, sure, I'm not doing anything this weekend, I'll do it. So between like Wednesday and Thursday till that following Monday, maybe about 4 days or so, so I developed 26 characters, and I renamed or came up with names for 24 out of 26 characters. Not Optimus Prime, not Prowl, all the others. Turned them in on Monday. Jim was happy with them. He forwarded it to Hasbro. They were happy with the bulk of them, the vast majority. And that's how I got my hands on Transformers. I have no idea what I was doing, but I stuck with it for 5 years. So here's what I did. I just wrote out longhand on these yellow legal pads the character, well, the names, in this case Optimus Prime was already named, profile, abilities, and so on. And then we had somebody in the office who would type it up for me and send it to Hasbro. So this was Optimus Prime's original, handwritten by me profile. And all these profiles were then eventually taken by me and abbreviated for the backs of the toy packaging, so they would fit into the toy packaging. So here's Optimus Prime, here's Megatron. Somebody just asked me, who interviewed me recently, what were your alternate names for Megatron? I don't remember, but Death Ray, Master, Slag Maker. Megatron's by far a better name. But anyway, a little side story that some of you probably heard. Initially, when I turned this name in, Megatron, which I think has a nice ring to it myself, maybe a little biased, Hasbro rejected it. And the reason they rejected it, I was told by their product manager, or whatever her title was, well, they thought, the Hasbro execs thought it sounded a little too scary. So now I understood going into this whole enterprise of working with Hasbro through Marvel that this is a Hasbro property, they can do whatever they want, it literally is their toy to play with, not mine. But in this case, I thought Megatron had such a nice feel to it for the main bad guy that I said very modestly, very carefully, said, he is the head bad guy, he's supposed to sound scary. They hadn't thought of it that way before. And they rethought, they reconsidered, and they said, okay, we can go with Megatron. So I saved Megatron as the name for Megatron. So, but other times, whenever I turned in any of these names, it had to go through an entire approval process. Part of the process was getting into the legal department because some of these names might already be used in some similar media, which I would be unaware of. So if they weren't trademarked for another toy or a comic book character or something, it was open to us. And sometimes they would be rejected for other reasons. One story, which I won't go into detail on, was one name I came up with that was rejected because it was a slang term for some kind of a obscene idea in Chicago. So I won't repeat the word. I won't repeat the name, but it was a good name. But I didn't know that. I was pretty innocent back then. I didn't live in Chicago. So here's Starscream. My profile for Starscream. Here's Ratchet. Ratchet I came up with because they were Nurse Ratchet in One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. And so I made Ratchet. Ratchet with an ambulance. I thought Ratchet. And also a ratchet is a tool that mechanics use to fix things. So I thought it was just a good name for an ambulance. Somebody who fixes things, and also had that connection to a popular movie at the time that starred Jack Nicholson. Okay, and so on and so on. So here's, this was Stalker. Stalker got rejected, and that became Ravage, which I think is a better name actually. So I mean, eventually that evolved into Ravage. Here's Fireball, which turned into something else as well. Jetfire, yeah, thank you for your help. But you see, like, none of these names were rejected because they didn't like them. You probably had some legal problems. And here's Bumblebee. Now, Bumblebee replaced a name that was Goldbug, so which eventually got used. But again, that was one of the initial batch of names that the other writing came up with. I don't know why they didn't go with Goldbug. It's not that different. But I came up with Bumblebee, and I guess people liked that name and kind of stuck, turned into a movie, et cetera, et cetera. And then and as I said, I had abbreviated versions that I took from my lengthier versions, and this went on the back. This went on the back of the toy box. And moving on, so one thing I recommended to Hasbro was to give all the characters power ratings. All right, and they said, "What do you mean by that?" So at the time, Marvel was coming out with a series of books called Marvel Universe, which is like an encyclopedia of all the Marvel characters. And Mark Grunewald, who was the editor of those books, came up with the idea of power ratings for our superheroes. You know, the Hulk is stronger than Ant-Man or something. So give each different ratings. So I suggested something similar to Hasbro, and so what I did was I took a piece of graph paper here, and I graphed it out to make sure that characters who were relatively stronger than each other, that characters that were relatively stronger than a different character would have a stronger power rating at all. This is all 26 characters mapped out on this ratings chart, and Hasbro loved it. They ran with it. Anybody who bought a toy box from that era knows, they put it on the back of the toy box in a graph, and you needed a piece of red cellophane paper to read it properly. I didn't suggest that. I wasn't trying to torture anybody who wanted to buy these toys and read power rating, but that was their idea. So then they took that and they printed it up really nicely. That was the Hasbro version of what I just showed you, and it shows you all the different names. Still a few names are still being crossed out and replaced, but eventually this is the original 26 names of the first 26 Transformers and their power ratings. And then, and here's the toy box for Optimus Prime, and here's what we talked about in the back. Took the abbreviated version of the profile that I wrote, and Hasbro made that incredibly difficult ratings chart for you to read, piece of red cellophane to do it. I wasn't a kid back then. Was it fun for you to look through that red cellophane? I don't know. Was it? Did you like that?
Yeah.
Hasbro knew what they were doing. Hasbro, they're geniuses. They were terrific. All right. So anyway, once it became apparent that Transformers was a success for all sorts of reasons, for the toy, for animation, for the comic book, Hasbro decided to come out with more Transformers. So here's the 1985 product listing that they sent me. And they were sent, by this point, initially, they had all the Japanese toys that the Transformers were initially based on. So I was given those products to look at to be able to come up with all the names and characteristics. But then, that got, we finished up with the Japanese toys basically after a year or two. And Hasbro started designing their own toys. They would give me lists of names, not names, but just what the characters are, what the toys are. A laser gun, a super jet, or whatever. And then eventually these moved into model sheets. So they showed me the different transformations that each one of these characters could do. Each one of these toys could do. So this is, you can see this is all the same character. I named him Nordalator. I think that name stuck. I can't swear to it. Probably. It did. Thank you. That's why Simon's here. I'll verify whatever I'm saying having a modicum of truth to it. And here's Snake Skin. Again, another model sheet, and parts of Snake Skin, what he turned into. Anyway, this all went into the development of all these characters. I wound up naming over the 5 years that I worked on Transformers about 250 of these guys. So if you collected those toys or watched the animation or the comic books, whatever, most of the characters that you saw in there were characters that I wound up naming. Had nothing to do with the movie, the 1986 movie. Had nothing to do with that. I was Sunbow or whoever worked on the movie, but everything else that came along during that period, almost everything else, wound up on my desk. Hasbro would give me those sheets of new toys coming up and model sheets, and now go to work. So, and then Marvel, sometime in the spring of '84, like I said, I started this in '83, comic book came out. So initially I was the editor of the comic book with issue #1, and with issue #5, I took over as the writer. I was no longer the editor. And this is the typical Marvel plot that I wrote. This is for issue #16, which I think eventually became issue #17, Return to Cybertron, Part 1, The Smelting Pool. Actually, this is my favorite story that I've done. And here's the cover to that issue. Okay. So most of the covers were drawn by the artists who drew the inside of the book. Not always, but in this case, and many other cases, I designed the covers. And then the artist drew them based on my designs. In a few cases, I actually drew the covers. So here's the cover in the smelting pool. Here's another beginning of the plot, Decepticon graffiti. And then I started realizing like the artists had so much burden put on them by me putting 20 new characters in the comic book. So I'd start out each plot with, here's a list of all the references you need to draw this issue. And that cast of characters, and the artist right away would be able to compile all of the different model sheets and get to work. And then cursing my name throughout. So here's the cover to Decepticon graffiti. Another cover I designed but did not draw by Herb Trippy. Here's a cover I did draw. Now, this is how it worked out. So I would do this sketch, all right? I would show it to the editor. The editor would approve it or ask for changes or whatever, and the sketch would take me 5 or 10 minutes, all right? And then eventually, it would turn into a cover. Now, this cover I actually drew. It's one of the 5 covers I drew. And there's a good reason I drew this cover. But you can see it's a lot more detailed, it's a lot more precise, and that can take me all day as compared to a 5 or 10 minute sketch. The reason I drew this cover was I wanted the artist who's drawing the interior of the book to understand what these little scraplet guys look like. You know, but I was trying to describe them, I figured rather than describe them, as they say, a picture's worth 1,000 words, I'll just draw the cover and he'll get the idea, and it worked out that way. Okay, so here's another cover where I did the sketch, and then Frank Stringer drew the cover based on my sketch. So you can see the artist typically was able to follow my idea fairly well. And here's yet another cover sketch, and yet another cover that, oops, I passed it on this side. Another cover that I myself drew. And another cover sketch, and another cover that I drew. A lot of these covers I drew, a lot of these comic books I wrote, because I was visiting places on vacation, and if I included those vacation spots in the comic book, my vacation became tax deductible. And I learned that from former Senator Al Franken when he was on Saturday Night Live back in the 80s. He did a skit about that. In any case, a lot of my biographies that I showed you earlier were collected in the Transformers Universe books. I understand this is a pretty pricey book to get nowadays. And meanwhile, as time went on, Hasbro was creating other aspects to the Transformers universe, so they would ask me to come up with new treatment, to develop the mythology even beyond what we had initially. This is my handwritten beginning to the headmasters, okay? And then that turned into this, and Target Masters, Headmasters, and that turned into a miniseries. I actually drew the cover of this one as well, which I wrote the miniseries. And then they would ask me like, hey, can you like write up something? And Hasbro would ask me, yeah, you brought in the idea of the creation matrix. Can you write that up so we can show it to whomever, like Sunbow Productions that would do the animation or whatever. So I would write up these little side things occasionally. And that's just me lying on my bed thinking of a plot. Okay, I'm done for the moment. What do you want to do next?
Okay, can we load up the other PowerPoint while I'm just chatting quickly? Yeah, so while Bob was working here in the US and setting everything up, over in the UK, in the offices of Marvel UK, we basically were doing our own Transformers comic. It was first fortnightly and then weekly. And very quickly, we started off obviously reprinting the original mini-series, and then when that became an ongoing series, but even so, because we were printing 11 pages a week or a fortnight, pretty soon we realised we were going to run out of comic strip material. We just didn't have enough story for a weekly or a fortnightly. So the editor of the comic, Sheila Cranner, petitioned writers to come up with story ideas for UK Transformers stories that could sit in between the flow of the original mini-series and then Bob's stories. The only brief was they had to be really, really self-contained because we didn't necessarily know what the American writers were going to do with the characters and the storylines. So we had to find little pockets of storytelling possibility. You know, characters like the Dinobots, if Bob marched them off stage left, we would bring them on stage right in the UK story because we could be fairly confident that they weren't going to be used again for a while. Eventually we did start seeing plots, but you know, that didn't happen for a while. So that was it. We were over there. I was just a startup writer. I'd written a few things for some British comics, and I got introduced to Sheila, who just handed me pretty much the stack of reference Bob has just shown you on screen. It would have been the original treatment, some of the original plots, maybe some of the first issues in art form, and toys and tech specs, and we were sent off to come up with these self-contained stories. Another writer, Steve Parkhouse, did the first story called Man of Iron, which was running as I was rapidly trying to write and come up with a story that became The Enemy Within. And then pretty much from there, you know, I think just because I could turn this stuff around faster than any other writer, I became the go-to writer on Transformers UK. There were other writers, James Hill and Mike Collins, but largely, very quickly, it became me, and then I was also assistant editor on the title, so, you know, rather incestuously, I wasn't giving myself work, but I was just there for the editor to go, we need another story now. And then the animated movie came out in 1986, and suddenly opened up a whole world of possibilities for us, because we found out either from Bob or from the Transformers office that apart from an adaptation of the movie, they weren't touching these characters. So all the new characters like Ultra Magnus, we suddenly had carte blanche to tell stories about them. And very rapidly we came up with a time-travelling story idea called Target 2006. The original draft we saw of the movie script had 2006 in it. Then of course we see the movie and it starts off with, it is the year 2005. But anyway, Target 2006 was a time-travelling story with Galvatron, Ultra Magnus, and all these characters we suddenly had free reign to use. And suddenly we had two eras to play with, the here and now and the future. So the UK comic just sort of galloped off on its own way a little bit. But we still had to see what Bob was doing, fit stories in around that. Sometimes we had to doctor the end of US issues slightly, so they fed smoothly into UK stories. So you'll see sometimes in Transformers UK, the tail end of a story, because it's not going to dovetail straight into the next US issue, we had to take that out and redo it in a UK version. I think there's one where Circuit Breaker is waking up in hospital and she's getting her circuits on her hands. We had to take that out of the American story and put it into the tail end of one of the British stories. So, you know, there were amendments. Nobody was watching what we were doing, thankfully. So yeah, that was really the story of Transformers UK. And then famously, Bob came over to, I met Bob before in Marvel America, and we got on famously. And then a little later, Bob came over and stopped by the offices in Marvel UK, as was the way, and we took Bob out for lunch. And rather casually over lunch, Bob said to me, you know what, I'm kind of burned out, I've written 50-something issues, a few mini-series, we need a new writer, would you like to do it? And I was just like, yes please, because, you know, not only was it, you know, more work, it was my first work for Marvel US, which was kind of a grail thing for me. So I was delighted to accept, and I think Bob can probably tell you this as well. I think you just more or less passed it to me and then told the editor I'd be the right guy for it.
Yeah, so just to make it clear, I was the writer, even though I was a Marvel editor, I was the writer, not the editor of the Transformers when I was writing the book. So yeah, I had an editor. So it's really the editor's job to find the talent, you know, whether the writer, the artist, whoever, the talent that does the books in his stable of books. So I was kind of going outside my lane, you know, to hire the new writer here. But, you know, we had a nice lunch. I figured, yeah, what the heck. You know, make him think better of the USA people. You know, if I give him his first USA book.
And you know, Bob did sort of put the footnote in after he'd offered me this that sales were down, the book was on the verge of cancellation, and I may only have 4 issues, 6 issues. Did I say that? You did.
Oh, okay.
And I thought, well, okay, I'll take that. I'll take 4 issues, I'll take 6 issues, whatever. But you know, we kept it going till issue 80 from 56. So you know, we got a good run on it. But I think then, you know, even with Great Generation 2, all of us thought that was pretty much it for Transformers. The toys had their day. You know, there was no TV show. Generation 2 came out with toys, but no real new TV show to support it. So all of us, I think, at that point figured that's it for Transformers, which then segues nicely into the little PowerPoint I'm going to show you now. Yeah. Because, of course, in 2002, or a little before that, Dreamwave, a Canadian publisher, you know, really sort of part of that sort of image rollout of new sort of artistic talent came out. And these were guys who had grown up with these stories, reading Bob's stories, reading my stories. And so suddenly we had this new generation, I guess, of artists and writers who knew the source material and were sort of taking it in a new direction. So, going to quickly take you through this, a lot of this is mostly because, of course, you all know Dreamwave only lasted for a bubble of 2 years. You know, they kind of mismanaged the money side of things. They were young and, you know, sort of, it was one of those comic book bubbles that burst a little bit. But, you know, in their time, Dreamwave were producing the most incredible artwork. They introduced us to the likes of Don Figueroa and Alex Milne and all these amazing artists we now know today. But these were artists who, unlike I guess a lot of the artists back in the day, were willing to put a ton of detail into these characters. So all of a sudden we had a kind of a real new look to Transformers that, you know, was almost kind of, you know, the way the image feeling was going at the time of making art almost as important, more important than the story. But yes, Dreamwave sadly just sort of lasted a bubble of 2 years. I got to do various things for them, The War Within and Armada, and I started also writing their Beast Wars comic, you know, that pretty much was on their verge of them going under. So I'm just going to take you through some of the art from that time. This is the cover, the original cover to Beast Wars issue 1, Don Figueroa's artwork for that. The original Beast Wars, before it became an IDW series, was much more connected to the 3rd season of the animated show. So a lot of the characters were straight out of, it was pretty much the tail end of that series, and then we suddenly kind of pulled them back to Earth, conveniently. So that's Don's cover. That's the original first page with Magmatron and the crashed Nemesis. And as you can see, we had all the cast, Rat Trap and Optimus Primal, or Optimal Optimus. We did a little recap of the show. And Dreamwave had published a one-off story in a summer special that we also wanted to incorporate into that, so it didn't just drift on its own. So that's why Rat Trap's having a kind of strange dream sequence. As you can see, we have Megatron sort of attached to the shuttlecraft and gradually breaking free. And you know, Don's artwork, Don, I think, was just one of the strongest artists to come out of the Dreamwave era, and wow, the detail he put into these things used to stagger me. Just quickly flick through a few more of those. That's the final page of issue 1, so we got to bring Megatron out as in his dragon form. That is the cover to issue 2. With Megatron, we went back to the trial of Megatron on Cybertron. And these, I'm just going to flip through these, but these are some of Alex Milne's Energon pages and covers that never saw print. We had the issue 31 of Energon came so close to coming out. It was printed, I'm pretty sure, and then probably pulped at some point, unless they ever existed. But the actual issue was complete, and it's very sad that we didn't get that out. That's one of the covers that never saw print for issue 32. That's a page from issue 32. And very quickly, these are some of the War Within pages. Age of Wrath finished with issue 3, and that's the splash page. Again, very close to coming out. It was all coloured, lettered. And again, these are just some of flipping through. Marcello Marter came in and helped out with the art on this issue. This was the big quintessence reveal from the issue. And we had these 2 characters that they created, which I'll show you the sketches for, Critical Mass and Atomic Pile. Yeah, which were going to be the sort of the clone creations of Shockwave that the dead Grimlock ends up in as a spark. Then we get to IDW. Now, I was also very lucky to be involved by Chris Ryle, the editor-in-chief, in creating what became known as the IDW-verse of Transformers. We floated a few ideas. Originally I suggested, strangely, what almost ended up being the end of the IDW-verse, a kind of Crisis on Infinite Cybertrons, that we were going to take all these different realities and create a new reality, one sort of prime Cybertron at the end of it. That didn't happen. We thought it might be too difficult for new readers. So instead we came up with Infiltration, which was a much more back to basics, almost like Marvel's Ultimate line. That was where we took our sort of template from, that way of taking Spider-Man back to a simpler but more modern context. We also redid the alt modes a little bit to make them contemporaneous to the time. So Megatron became a P99 Walther instead of the original P38, I think it is, am I right? So yeah, just generally, there was a kind of move to make the Transformers more, the whole gist of Infiltration was that they were there on Earth. They weren't suddenly waking up and turning into planes. They'd been there for a while, in secret, undercover. It was all very conspiracy theory laden. And so, it made sense to make them fit the era. This is our human character, Verity. E.J. Sue also was really good with human characters, was why we went with him for Infiltration and so forth, because we wanted it. I think the human perspective is really useful in Transformers. It makes the robots themselves seem bigger, more impressive, awesome, awe-inspiring, if you have that human viewpoint and you can have that looking up at them idea instead of them all just face to face. That's just an Andrew Wildman cover, pencils for issue 1. These are some of Dom's designs for Stormbringer. So that's Bludgeon, recreated as a Cybertronian tank. Thunderwing with various alt modes. You just had to say to Don, we need Thunderwing, and he'd come up with all the old modes and everything else. He really was an incredible artist. So that's the end of that. But yes, that's basically where we got up to, and of course the IDW verse is just about to become the Skybound, yes. It's so different. There's too many things with Sky in them at the moment. And that's all just kicking off with Void Rivals. So here we are, we're nearly 40 years in, and we're open to questions, I think, if there's still some time.
Should we answer all the questions?
There's a hand at the back there.
I just wanted to ask, you created the record, correct?
Yeah.
What were your thoughts on them when they were in Dark Luminous and as far as?
Well, I'm always happy. However they turn up in other Transformers media, and I'm sure Bob's the same, that you get a swell of pride when a character that you help create or embellish or give depth to turns up in something else. The Wreckers were just, as always, we just took a lot of characters that Bob wasn't using and stuck them together into a commando team. And that was great. We hoovered up in characters Bob wasn't using in the American comic, and that gave us that way of being able to feature those. But certainly, if I see a character even like the Fallen or something I have a hand in, I'm really pleased and proud that it gets used in other media, the movies or other animated TV shows. And I'm sure you feel the same.
Oh yeah. Well, yes and no.
Oh.
I mean, yes, I'm very happy. I don't even want to go there. I don't want to complain. But I'm very happy that things that I worked on 35, 40 years ago are still popular. They're still, all of you interested in what it was that we did back then, and it's still current. Because there's so much, especially in comic book industry, so much of what you do in comic books. Not so much anymore with all the movies that are out, but it's just very transitory. That issue comes out for that month, and that's it, and you go to the next issue, and nobody ever thinks about it again. But certainly not the case with Transformers.
Where I do feel sometimes we should get a little bit of, I don't know, just accreditation.
That's where I was going to go. I held myself back. Yeah.
Is when they produce a toy based on a comic character. That's when I do feel it's like, well, come on, this is something we dropped into a comic, and you have now, either made a toy of it that has just that name, or sometimes it's literally that character, like Giaxus recently. And that's the only time where I feel a little niggle that there should be some kind of nod to the people, artist and writer who created that character.
Okay, so now that Simon is over so there was a little movie that came out a couple of years ago called Bumblebee. I named Bumblebee. They never talked to me, I never got credit, any kind of acknowledgement. So that's where I was trying to not go, but Simon started.
Other questions? Can somebody do the
Yes.
picking of
I got you.
brains and handing a microphone?
So at this point, I'm gonna, we got time for maybe 3 more questions. They gotta be real quick.
We can try it.
Yeah, we can stretch it.
Yeah.
Okay, we'll see what happens.
Okay.
So you're gonna do that too. Go for it.
This is for Bob. You said you wrote all the profiles for the Marvel Comics Transformers characters, except for the movie ones.
Yeah.
Those bios were truncated into the ones printed on the back of the toys. Did you have any say in that truncation, or was that done after?
I wrote the truncation.
Oh.
Yeah, I said.
Let's start with that.
This is a question for both of them. If you had the choice to draw another character completely by yourself, what would it be?
I would first find a very talented artist to draw the character, but occasionally, the thing is the Transformers universe is so rich, you very rarely need to create characters for it. When I was writing Transformers 84 recently, I thought I really need a narrator for this series, someone to follow through it. Because we were jumping back into that original 4-issue series and adding in extra story or context, we needed eyes on it, and I thought I need a character who could conceivably know the Autobot side and the Decepticon side of what's going on. But I didn't need to create a character. There was a perfectly good character, counterpunch, who could jump between the two. So, generally, I think there's normally a character for the job.
Yeah, I wasn't looking to create new characters, except there was an occasion or two where I needed it for a story. So specifically, I wrote a 2-part story, The Smelting Pool and The Bridge to Nowhere. I needed certain characters that were disposable. So I created a character named Straxus, and there was another one, a runty little character. What about, I forgot his name already, somebody probably knows it. Anyway, Spanner, yeah. So, Spanner was the bridge. That was another character. It was another character I created. Scrounge. Yeah, so I created some characters for that particular storyline that had to fit. But I wasn't looking to create new characters generally. Like Simon said, there was so many, there was such a richness and such a wide universe of characters that we already had. We didn't need to create a whole bunch of new ones.
I mean, one tiny side story is that when we needed a bounty hunter for this kind of spaghetti western in space we were doing in the UK comic, there really wasn't a Transformers bounty hunter. They were all Autobot or Decepticon. There wasn't somebody we could conveniently use. So that's really why we almost had to come up with Death's Head, because he was just that part of that spaghetti western homage we were doing in the story. So occasionally it does happen.
This is a question for both of you. What?
Oh yeah.
I know. What lesser known or obscure character that you created or played with do you wish you played with more, or would you have liked to have done more with?
All right, so generally, I would create storylines around certain characters and start developing these characters, and then I would get whatever we did back then, fax or something. It was pre-internet. I get something from Hasbro with a list of, here's 20 more characters we want you to create and introduce into the comic book. So I didn't really have the opportunity or the luxury of developing characters as much as I might have in certain cases, because I always was under the pressure. You may not have seen it as a fan reading a comic book, but as a writer, I knew that I had to slide these guys out off the stage and get on all these new characters.
Bob's sort of bios and text specs were so, in depth that what I looked for ultimately as the brand were not the ones that hadn't got that depth, so you could take a little bit of dramatic license with them a little bit more. So characters like Bludgeon, I would take something like, oh great, he's got this martial art called Metallicato, and then I'd run with it into something else. So I did start to look for the characters with the sketchier text specs as we went along that you could just add layers to. So Thunderwing, Bludgeon, that kind of character.
Hi. So, the internet makes things very inappropriate, even though you guys wrote very nice stories. Kiss players exist, but it's from Japan. Yeah. So, what do I ask? Is there a character that's like you that you made, and who do they go with?
No. What was just the last bit of that?
Like if they have a partner, not they have to be in a relationship, but who's their number two?
Yeah, there's a lot. I mean, IDW, the sort of later IDW comics did a lot more of the sort of relationships between Transformers. I think Bob and I come from a slightly simpler era where these were comrades in arms, and we didn't bother over much with that.
Even though I guess when I was writing comics, the characters were commonly referred to as he. I tried initially, when I was doing the initial 26 characters, I tried to introduce a couple of female characters. Hasbro said, no, these are boys' toys. no females, and 2 years later they introduced RC in the movie. But so basically it wasn't even an option, you know, like I wasn't thinking in terms of any kind of relationships, you know, other than they're comrades in arms.
Because of the sprawling cast, I'm just curious from a storytelling perspective, do you start more often with a plot and find someone that would fit the plot, or do you say, no, I haven't done anything with in charge in a while, can you tell something about it?
I mean, certainly the way I started writing Transformers was very much like, here's the characters, you know, what's the perfect fish out of water situation for this character? Who is the best character for this character to be pitted against that would push them both out of their comfort zone? And I think that hasn't changed in almost all my writing. I tend to start with character. You know, you might have a grand story idea, but you know, I still look for character above all else when I write.
I'm similar. I would very often have an overarching plot for the characters that would fit the bill. But then there are other times, like I said, Hasbro would say, we want you to introduce Fortress Maximus. So I'd have to come up with a story around that specific character.
Time for one more question.
This question's for both of you. When you wrote and created the characters, were you given an image? Like, were you shown what, say, Gears looked like before you named Gears? And then Simon, did you have to create dialogue for him? I'm curious how that creative process went for both of you.
Well, I kind of went over some of this in the PowerPoint, which is initially Hasbro gave us the toys because they were just adapting Japanese toys that already existed. And then as time went on, they gave us model sheets. So I had plenty of reference, sufficient enough reference for me to create characters from. As far as the dialogue, I mean, it was up to the writers, Simon and myself, to put words in their mouth, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Hasbro would tell us, oh, this guy has to talk like this, or this guy has to talk like that. We would write it.
I mean, you know, I still can't not be influenced by some of the cartoon series voices. You know, if I write Starscream dialogue, I tend to hear the actor doing Starscream when I do it. But I mean, I think generally that one little story that maybe we can finish with is that we originally didn't have those wonderful model sheets in the UK. We got a lot of stuff, but we didn't get those lovely character turnarounds or model sheets. So all we had as reference were the toys and the pack art. So up to a point, the UK stories are all based, the art is all based on the toys, and you can literally see the transition between issues 78 and 79, where we suddenly got all the character turnarounds and model sheets, and the artists were just breathing a sigh of relief because obviously the characters were refined and simplified from the toys.
Okay, give it up for Simon and Bob.